So today's seminar is a seminar that is particularly focused on climate change and the disaster domain more broadly. Professor Ilan Noy is our chair in the economics of disasters and climate change, and he will look at disasters through the lens of, or through an economic lens, but with a specific focus on the SDGs. So the way that we tend to run these seminars, there we go, sorry that was a bit of a delay, is that our speakers who are chairs, funded chairs in a particular discipline, they don't necessarily talk directly at the research on the SDGs, but they relate their extensive research to the SDGs, to have a common roadmap and a common way of communicating around some of these challenges that affect New Zealand as they affect many other parts of the world. And Ilan's presentation will specifically make reference to SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, and SDG 13, climate action. But in a quick preview of his presentation, I think he might speak to more than just those three, which of course is enriching. So I hand over to Ilan to talk about the SDGs and disasters through an economic lens. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Christian. And thank you for coming. Can you hear me? Yeah? Good. My intention is to speak for maybe 40 minutes or so and then leave plenty of time for questions. But if you want to stop me for a question or a clarifying query or something like that, then please feel free to stop me at any time. As Christian mentioned, I'm an economist, and I usually apologize for that. But that is the lens I'm going to use to talk about disasters, the link between disasters. In this case, I use this picture because we have a volcano here. We have a typhoon as well going on, so there's plenty of action there. And then to link between those events, like typhoons and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, to the SDGs. Now, the SDGs, as you know, include the 17 development goals. When I try to, put together this presentation, I try to think, okay, which of these SDGs are directly relevant to what I do in terms of my work on disasters and climate change? And actually, I found it a lot more than just the three that we've originally highlighted. And I actually blocked only 3 as irrelevant, maybe. And even those are not, strictly speaking, irrelevant. So I'm not going to go around and talk all about all of these SDGs one by one and describe to you how they relate to what I do, but rather just give you some general insights or a few insights that I think are relevant. Okay, we start actually with number 17, and that's the idea of partnership for the goals, the idea that we need to do this together. Now, if we look at disasters, 2015 was a very momentous year, not only because we agreed on the SDGs in 2015, but we had 3 other international agreements at the same year, right? We had the Paris Climate Change Agreement agreed at the end of 2015. We also had the Sendai Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, which was held earlier in that year, in March 2015, in which we signed, and I mean New Zealand, is a signatory to the Sendai Agreement for disaster risk reduction. And we also had the Financing for Development conference in Addis, where we also agreed to various benchmarks in terms of how much we should invest in this goal for development. Now, I sort of hinted that maybe we made a lot of promises in 2015, and we're not quite on track to fulfilling those promises. clearly, in terms of the SDGs, while we possibly were on track before, when was it that COVID-19 emerged? The end of December 2019 or January 2020. We maybe were on track to do that. After the last, year and a half, horrible year and a half, we are very far away from achieving the SDGs. But also the other ones, I think we're not quite doing what we promised we will do in 2015. Okay, in terms of the financing for development, basically most countries promise to donate at least 0.7% of their GDP. That actually goes back to the Millennium Development Goals before that. We are very far from that. We, meaning New Zealand, is far from that. But I think New Zealand is not even reaching 50% of that. But most other countries, I think there might be 3 countries in the world who reach that. Used to be the UK, but now Boris Johnson has cut that. It's then I think the Netherlands, Denmark, and Finland, or Norway maybe. So it's the usual suspects, right? And in terms of the Sendai Agreement, we've committed to various things around Sendai. The very basic thing was we commit to telling you how much disaster is damaging our economy. And we haven't even achieved that. If we look at what disasters do to the economy of New Zealand, or how much damage they wreak in New Zealand, we have no idea. So what was the sort of the bill surrounding the floods last week in Westport? I think we will never know because we don't do the accounting for that. We don't count that. We don't know how much the floods in Canterbury, in Ashburton were, how much damage they caused a couple of months ago. We don't collect that data. We just don't. So we don't know. So even the very basic thing of just counting so we know whether we are doing disaster risk reduction, we're not quite doing. Hopefully, eventually, we will get there. In terms of climate change, I think anybody who opens a paper knows that we're not quite there in terms of our commitments to the Paris Agreement. Not we in New Zealand, but the world more generally. In terms of climate action, so climate action is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's kind of a weird goal because it talks about action rather than some kind of a outcome. But I just wanted to show you this because it's the Tokyo Games are running now, so it's an interesting piece of data. That is what you see there on the graph is the day in which the sakura, the cherry blossoms, blossom in the main temple in Kyoto every year. Now, the nice thing about that is we know exactly when that happened, and we have continuous record of that since 812. Okay? So every year since 812, they record the date in which the cherries blossom in Kyoto. So you clearly see that something is happening in the last century, right? It's becoming earlier every year. Okay, the cherry blossoms is blossoming earlier every year. Now, if you want to really be convinced that something is happening, then look at the data for this year. This year, the peak was in 26th of March. That's the earliest it has ever been recorded in Kyoto. Okay, the earliest day, and since in the past, 1,200 years. It has never been 26th of March. There were, I think, a couple of years where it was the 27th of March, about 1,000 years ago. So there is something going on, okay? But for me, actually, what is interesting about climate change is it's not the average temperature that is going down that is worrying, okay? And it's not even the average, or for that matter, sea level rise that is going up. It's the fact that the frequency and intensity of extreme events is changing. That is the important issue with climate change. Now, here on the slides, I have data from a paper we did on New Zealand floods. And we look, I don't have the labels on the column, so forgive me for that, but that's why I can explain that to you. So there's a bunch of floods that happened in the last 10 years or so, a bit more than 10 years, 15 years maybe. These are the costliest floods in the last 15 years, but not including the ones in the last couple of years. So, my guess is the one in Westport last week would go into this list as some of the costliest floods, including, and the one in Ashburton as well. And then this column here shows you roughly what is the contribution of climate change to that event. So those events became more likely by about, most of them by about 30%, some of them less, some of them more. Okay? I'm not going to get into how they calculated that, but anyway, I didn't do that. That's climate scientists, people who are much more skilled than I am. I told you I'm just a lowly economist. But then we look at the damage from these floods, and this is only the privately insured damages from those floods. We multiply the two, and we get this number, which is those floods, the climate change footprint of those floods in New Zealand in the last 10 years is about 140 million New Zealand dollars. Okay? These are rough numbers. It doesn't really matter if it's 140 or 160. But that's the climate change footprint of those floods. Okay? Now, why am I telling you this? Because those floods, the climate change footprint of those floods is a lot more than, for example, sea level rises caused damage to New Zealand up to today. Okay? I'm just trying to convince you that the important component of climate change for us is the changing frequency and intensity of extreme events. And here we're talking mostly about floods, strong wind events, and droughts, all of which are predicted to become more frequent and more intense in New Zealand. And a lot of the public discussion sort of talks about sea level rise. Incredible amount of discussion in New Zealand is talking about sea level rise and climate changes, if that is the big risk for us. That's a big risk for Bangladesh, and it's a big risk for Tuvalu and Kiribati, but it's not a big risk for us. The biggest risk by far for us is those changing frequency and intensity of extreme events. Okay? One more piece of evidence I think that's relevant to this idea of climate action and why we need to do climate action now. This is sort of hot off the press from a paper we're just finishing now. It's actually not on the press yet. It will be on the press. It's on the press now. It will be off the press soon. This is from Hurricane Harvey in Houston in the US in 2017. So they had a big event, big hurricane. You might remember that 2017 was a horrible year for hurricanes. There was 3 big hurricanes, Irma, which went to Florida, Harvey, which went to Houston, and then Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico. Now, what we did there is we looked at the contribution of climate change to the flooding that occurred because of Hurricane Harvey in Houston. So what you see here, there's basically, we looked at all the houses in Houston, about 1.1 million houses. Okay? For each one of them, we could classify them whether they were not flooded, about 1 million were not flooded, so only 100,000 houses were flooded. I say only with a sort of a caveat there, right? But between those houses that were flooded, there were 2 types of houses. Ones that were anyway would have been flooded even if we had no climate change, but climate change made that flooding more severe because it increased the level of the water. And those houses that without climate change wouldn't have been flooded. There would have been Hurricane Harvey, but with climate change, without climate change, there would have been less rain and therefore less flooding, and therefore those houses were not flooded. So roughly, about 100,000 houses were flooded in Hurricane Harvey. Roughly half of them were flooded because of climate change. The precise number is 49,000 and 51,000, but let's stick with 1/2, it's good enough, right? And what's more striking about that is that these houses, the ones that were flooded, were much more likely to be owned by Hispanics than the houses that were not flooded. So both the storm and climate change hit the Hispanic population disproportionately to their share in the population. Okay? Now, worse than that, generally speaking, if income was higher in Houston for homeowners, not income, sorry, the value of the house was higher, they were more likely to be flooded because they were more likely to be living next to a water, river or a canal or something like that. But that relationship switches when you're talking about Hispanics. Okay? So when you're talking about Hispanics, the lower income Hispanics were more likely to be flooded. Okay? So Hispanics were hit, low income Hispanics were especially hit, and worst of all, Houston and the US in general has this rule that if you are within the floodplain, then you are required to buy flood insurance. So basically, most properties within the floodplain have flood insurance, and most properties outside the floodplain do not have flood insurance. Right? Flood insurance is sold separately from regular insurance. So here in New Zealand, we have all hazards lumped together. In the US, they separate flood insurance separately for historical reasons. So what we find is, first of all, the maps are not that good. So a lot of houses that were in the floodplain did not flood, and a lot of houses that were not in the floodplain did experience flood damage. And all the disparity for Hispanics is from those properties that are outside the floodplain, meaning they were uninsured. Okay? So not only Hispanics were more likely to be flooded, it's more likely that low-income Hispanics were flooded, and more likely that low-income Hispanics without flood insurance were flooded. Okay? So what I'm trying to tell you is the general message is climate change has a very unequal impact across different groups in the population, and we need to drill into that to be able to understand what is going on. And if we care about the SDGs, and obviously you're here, so you do care about the SDGs, we need to take that into account when we design policies. Okay? We hope to replicate the same kind of analysis here in New Zealand for places like Ashburton and Westport, but there's a lot of data that works behind this kind of work. Okay, that's about climate action. Now, when I was trying to decide, okay, what I'm trying to link disasters, and disaster you can think of geophysical disasters like earthquakes and mass movements of what they call dry mass movements of soil or volcanic activity, or you can think of meteorological disasters, or whatever type of disaster you want to think about, including epidemics, by the way. It's a disaster like all these other disasters. Why and how are disasters important to the SDGs? Which SDGs I want to most emphasize? Well, I actually want to emphasize mostly 1, 2, 3, and 4. Why? Because as an economist, I think these are the most important ones. They're basically the ones that are used by the UN when they're doing their Human Development Index. Right? The Human Development Index, which you might be familiar with, looks at health, wealth, and education. Right? And basically, SDGs 1, 2, 3, and 4 are that. And SDGs 1, 2, 3, and 4 are directly impacted by disasters. Okay, so how do I know these things? First of all, in a survey, public opinion survey, international public opinion survey on the SDGs, basically the top 3 reasons that respondents said was a barrier to achieving the SDGs. The first two are lack of political leadership and lack of awareness. These are kind of, for me, they're a bit vague and unhelpful. I once knew a political scientist who talked about, when other people say there's no political will to do something, he said it's like the economy is saying the economy is not growing because there's no economic will for it to grow. It's meaningless statement, okay? And when we talk about no awareness or no lack of leadership, these are also meaningless statements. Why is there no lack of leadership? Why is there lack of awareness among people and policymakers? So I think these are not very useful. The third one is, of course, what I'm trying to talk to you about, okay? It is these major shocks that are the problem with SDGs, with achieving the SDGs, are these shocks, and we've seen that in the last 16 months, right? Maybe we were on track, and we can argue about that. Maybe we were on track on achieving the SDGs, but suddenly we got whacked, completely whacked off course with the pandemic. Okay, another sort of piece of evidence I want to try and convince you. This is thanks to Girol, the head of your school. So this is the GDP per capita in the UK in the last bit more than 1,000 years. You see something quite striking in this figure, right? So it's hard not to notice that something different has happened since the 19th century, right? Now, what Girol has pointed out, and I think is very interesting, if you look at GDP growth in the last 1,000 years, okay, this is the UK, right? This is the graph for the UK. I'm doing it for the UK because that's one of the only countries for which we have GDP growth for 1,000 years. Estimated from various things, but, you know, and it takes some, eat it with a large grain of salt because, you know, there's a lot of assumptions that go in there. But what's striking here, for me at least, is that the big difference, what is happening after the 1800 that led to this dramatic shift, okay? The episodes of high growth were there even before. What's unique after 1800, you don't have these declines, these shocks, these episodes where you are, I don't know if this works and anybody can see it, but you don't have these episodes of very large declines in income. After 1800, we largely managed to not have those anymore. That's the big difference. We managed not to have those shocks rather than to grow faster. Okay? That's why the economy of the UK has been growing so spectacularly, since the 1800s. Not because the episodes of high growth are higher, but because there's no longer episodes of large declines in economic activity. Okay? So if we can manage to prevent the cost of these shocks, these disasters, then we can achieve the SDGs. Without preventing that, we're not going to be able to achieve the SDGs. Okay? One sort of another answer, why can disasters, how come they have this impact on the metrics of the SDG? Here I'm talking about wealth, health, and education, so the basic metrics of the Human Development Index. Two potential issues that come up with disasters. One is disasters sometimes cause a change in the political system, and they manage to throw societies asunder in some way and can be very, very disruptive. So sometimes there can be beneficial, right? So in some instances we have where disasters somehow instituted a change that was positive, okay? The Meiji Restoration in Japan is an example of that. It happened after a series of earthquakes, which led to loss of confidence in the traditional authorities and led to the Meiji Restoration. or at least that's one interpretation of what led to the Meiji Restoration. Okay? But in most cases, we see that disasters actually cause the opposite, and they cause institutional change that is very harmful. The etching there is from the Lisbon earthquake in 1755. The Lisbon earthquake was probably the first international disaster in the sense that it's the first one that generated international aid, significant international aid. It was a terrible disaster. There was an earthquake offshore in Portugal. This was done, it was in All Saints' Day in the morning, so everybody was at home cooking. Of course, cooking on open fire. The earthquake happens, a fire starts in the city. So you have the destruction from the earthquake, then you have the destruction from the fire. Everybody in Lisbon ran to the river, down to the river, because there was a fire, and then a tsunami wave came up the river. Okay, so a terrible event, which also led to various institutional changes in Portugal. Initially positive changes, but eventually reversed completely and maybe even made things worse for Portugal. So one issue is the fact that disasters are a shock to the institutions that govern societies and can be very, very negative shocks. Another example maybe of a negative shock is the Iranian Revolution in 79, which happened after an earthquake, about 10 months before the revolution. And a lot of commentators at the time point to the earthquake as the beginning of the revolution in Iran. If you look at income per capita in Iran, afterwards, it's probably declined by about 60 to 70%. That's a huge decline in income per capita. The other thing is that disasters in general shake our confidence in the future, or shake the confidence of a lot of people potentially in the future. Example for that, at least in my view, is San Francisco. San Francisco used to be by far the largest city and the most thriving and most dynamic city in California until it is hit by the 1906 earthquake. So the 1906 earthquake hit, there's a big fire, all of the area that we now know as Chinatown in San Francisco gets burned. And at the time, they don't really understand earthquakes, so plate tectonics is still 50 years away. In terms of our understanding of why earthquakes happen. So people don't understand what's going on, and they realize that this area is risky. And we see an economic shift in California to Los Angeles. And basically, since then, Los Angeles is the sort of the dynamic engine of the state of California. And you can easily date that shift to that 1906. Earthquake. So I think without the 1906 earthquake, the map of California would have been very different in terms of where people live, where is economic activity. It starts to be reversed only in the 1980s and 90s when high tech emerges out of Stanford. And we get Silicon Valley and all of that, and we start to get more economic activity in San Francisco. But San Francisco in the 1960s was where all the hippies went, because it was a very cheap, poor place to go. It was much cheaper than LA, so they went to San Francisco, even though the weather is much nicer in LA. Disasters, and here we're talking about a good 70, 80 years of negative impact on a city. So disasters can have those long-term impacts. And again, if we want to achieve the SDGs, we need to worry about those long-term adverse impacts. Other long-run concerns. Well, in utero exposure is incredibly important. We know that from child development. What happens to the child in utero is very important, and the first 3 years are also very important. But we have, for example, striking research from Peru. So in Peru, they had in 1970, they had an earthquake in an area called Ancash. And what people have done maybe 5 years ago or so, they looked at the census data from Peru and looked at people who were in utero during the earthquake in Ancash. Okay? And what they found that these people, as adults, had less education and less income than comparable groups. So comparable groups were people who were born just a year or two later in Ancash, or born at the same time but in other places in Peru. Okay? So just exposure in utero to the earthquake was led to an average 1 year less of schooling, which is very significant, and of course, corresponding to that lower income. Okay? Now, the striking thing about that, they could also follow the next generation. So they could follow the generation of those people who were born to people who were in utero during the Ancash earthquake. Okay? So incidentally, the Ancash earthquake was in 1970. I was born in 1970. So sort of, if I were in Peru, I would have been in utero during the earthquake. My kids, right? Basically my kids. You can follow, they follow that generation. And that generation, if their mother was in utero in Ancash in 1970, that generation had half a year of schooling less. Okay? So that impact continued to the next generation. Why? It's not rocket science. By far the most important determinant of how much schooling you get is how much schooling your parents got. Right? So when we look across country everywhere, that's by far the most important determinant, right? So now clearly, interestingly there, it's only through the mother. If the father was exposed to the Ancash earthquake, that didn't matter much. But if the mother was in utero during the Ancash earthquake, her kids would be less educated. So this is 50 years later. We still have an impact from that single earthquake. So again, if we have these long-run concerns, then without dealing with that problem, we're not going to deal with the SDGs. There's other issues. There's issues like child labor. So we know that disasters push more kids towards labor, towards child labor. So again, we will have those. If a kid is pulled out of school, that is going to have an impact that will last for generations, right? In terms of education, and as I said, next generation and so on. So if we don't deal with these issues of disasters, we will have more kids being pulled out of school, and we have plenty of evidence. So I had a PhD student, for example, who did work on Indonesia and showed that educational attainment in areas that were hit by disasters, and Indonesia is blessed with various types of disasters, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, droughts, everything you can imagine. So if your community was hit by a disaster, the average educational attainment went down. Now, average educational attainment will go on to the next generation. Okay? The picture, by the way, if you're wondering, is my son, whom Arthur knows. So he wasn't affected by that. Okay, one more thing. Existential risk. I think we are at least one thing that I sort of learned from the last 18 months is that we're not very good at thinking carefully about the risks that we are facing. We were hit by a pandemic that was perfectly expected. Everybody anticipated that. In sort of scenarios of what kind of pandemic is most likely, the highest likelihood event was a coronavirus emerging out of China. Nothing very surprising about that. We have had another coronavirus emerge in 2003, the SARS epidemic. Luckily, SARS was a lot less infectious, much more deadly, but a lot less infectious. So we have in here We didn't expect, in terms of economics, I think economists have completely missed the ball on this one. Okay, there has been very, very, very little research in economics about the likely impacts of an economic impact of a pandemic. Okay, actually, at one point I went online and checked. There's more papers written in economics on baseball than on pandemics. Much more, by the way. Why? Because there's a lot more data on baseball than on pandemics. And economists like data. So it's a problem. We have all these and I note that this pandemic, this specific pandemic that has hit us, is a fairly mild pandemic. It's not very lethal, right? It's less than 1% mortality. SARS was more than 10 times as deadly as COVID-19, okay? And the other thing, from an economic perspective, imagine what would have happened to the global economy and global society if we had the same virus, the same mortality rate, but hitting the young instead of the old. The panic would have been much higher and would have led to all these other consequences, I think, that would have been, frankly, terrible to contemplate. Okay, so the same event, just changing the structure of mortality would have, the demographics of mortality would have made a very, very big difference. Okay, now imagine, of course, a similar pandemic with the mortality rate of SARS and not of COVID-19. Okay, so there's plenty of existential risk, and I think to some extent we are like, the way I see this penguin, he doesn't notice what's coming. I don't know if it's true. He might be shaking in his boots, but that's the way I interpret this picture. And I think to some extent we are not thinking carefully enough about the kind of existential risks we are facing. And frankly, if we are facing those existential risks, we're not going to achieve, if we don't exist, SDGs become a bit meaningless, right? So we need to think about those. If we are worried about the SDGs, we also need to think about these things. And we now know that we should have been thinking about pandemics a lot more if we are worried about the SDGs. Some kind of disasters that we can see as potentially extinction risks, solar flares or something, or they call them solar storms or space storms. They can be incredibly damaging to electrical grids. Okay, they might not harm anyone, but they completely can destroy our electrical grid. Now imagine our society if we don't have electricity for 6 months. Most people can't imagine themselves without their phone for an hour. Imagine no electricity for 6 months. How do we structure our society? Okay, and solar storms can do that, and they have done that in the past. So, electricity networks are around for a bit more than a century. So we didn't have a solar storm that have pulled our electricity, but we had some local events. So there was one in Siberia a few years ago, but it hit Siberia. Who lives in Siberia except a few Siberians? Imagine the same event happening in New York or somewhere like that. It's very difficult to really even comprehend what we will do and what will happen and how people will behave and so on. There's other risks that we can think about. Super volcanoes is one of them. Probably not much we can do about that. About solar storms, we can do a lot. So we can have backup systems so that we can reconstruct our electricity system quickly if there is a solar storm. Biological risks. As I said, pandemics can be a lot more awful than COVID-19. COVID-19 is actually quite a mild pandemic. And the scariest, for me at least, is AI, artificial intelligence. We now have we now have sort of robotic weapons that can independently kill. Right? The technology is there. We use that all the time, all these drones that the Americans used to assassinate all these people in Yemen. Right now, they are programming those drones to not shoot if a human operator doesn't press a button. But that's just a choice that they've made to program it this way. The technology is there now for someone to produce enough drones to, destroy humanity if they want to. The technology is already there. This is not some future risk. This is current risk, and we're doing very little to prevent that. So all these things, if we don't think about them, we're not going to deal with the SDGs. So we need to keep an eye on those balls if we are worried about the SDGs. Some optimism, I think I need after these messages. Shakespeare was the first person who used the word disaster in the English language. This is from King Lear, and he's saying that we always blame for our disasters. The emphasis here is on our disasters. We are blaming the moon, the sun, the stars. So we are blaming everyone else other than ourselves. Okay, while principally these are all our fault. Okay, now that's an optimistic message, because if it's our fault, if these things are because of us, then we can do something about them. Okay, if it's just the wrath of God, or as Shakespeare said, heavenly compulsion or spherical predominance, whatever that means, then there's not much we can do about it. But Shakespeare is trying to say, no, it's not that. It's our disasters. Now that insight is not new. At least in economics, it starts with Amartya Sen, who is a Nobel Prize-winning Indian economist. He grew up in Bengal in the 1930s and 40s, and he later on in the 1970s started to looking at the time in Bengal when he was growing up. There was the Bengal famine, which was a horrible famine, killed probably between 3 and 5 million people. And when he looked at this event, and so made a lot of impression of him as a young child. He grew up in a prosperous family, but he said he saw a lot of the consequences of that famine. And what he realized is that at the time of the famine, India was exporting food. Okay? Well, India was a British colony at the time, and the British overlords told it to export food. Okay? So for him, the famine, it used to be thought of as a sort of a natural disaster, an event dictated by natural forces, a drought, and so on. What he discovered is no. India, yes, there was a drought, so there was some, fewer grain available in Bengal, where he was growing up. But other parts of India had no drought, and they were actually producing more grain than in usual times. But they were forced to export that rather than ship it to Bengal by the British. And what happens in Bengal is basically food became too expensive for the poor to buy. Okay, so it's an economic event. And of course, if a famine is an economic event, then you can solve it. It's not a natural disaster, it's an unnatural disaster. And indeed, he observed later that India had a famine about every decade during British rule, and not a single famine since independence in 1947. Nothing. Okay? And it's not as though droughts suddenly stopped in India after 1947. So disasters are always unnatural events. And if there are unnatural events, we can solve them. Okay, so if we can solve them, why aren't we solving them? And here, there's plenty of research in what we call behavioral economics that talks a lot about the ways people, humans, think and behave, which prevents us from solving this problem. So yes, I've been talking too much. Yeah, I'm just going to skip this. But the point is there's all these issues like myopia and amnesia and availability, and I can talk more about if we have time for questions. We do have a bit of time for questions.
I would love to leave some time.
Yeah. Okay, so I will just end with Eeyore, who observed that we haven't had an earthquake lately, and touch wood, we haven't.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And apologies for keeping an eye on the time, but I suspect there are some questions, and we do have some questions that have come in through Zoom from Australia and from elsewhere. But I would like to start by offering up the opportunity to ask questions to the room. Who would like to get started? We can go to Zoom if that's preferred. We should be able to bring them up here. So the first question that came up, which I now can't locate on here. Sorry, I get my computer. It's from a colleague, a prime colleague, Edith Cohen, over in Perth. And this question is, I can just read that out. Given the increasing frequency and intensity of climate change-related natural disasters, and on the basis of the costs associated with that, has there been any study to look into the net saving, if any, once countries achieve net zero emissions, and the number of years it takes to reach the break-even point, given the amount of investment required in the first place?
No. There hasn't been quantification of that. So if you look at the economic estimates of the cost of climate change, okay, they typically ignore or almost completely ignore the cost of extreme events. They just look at what will be the impact of the change in the average temperature or what will be the impact of sea level rise. Okay? And they almost completely, in some cases, they sort of add a multiplier there. So I think the Nordhaus model, which is maybe the most well-known model of the economic cost of climate change, adds another 10 or 15% to their calculated cost associated with extreme weather events. I think they are vastly underestimating that. Okay. Now, even with those estimates, which underestimate the cost of the climate change associated costs with extreme weather events, the cost for mitigation for greenhouse gas emission is the benefit cost is still clearly on the side of we should be mitigating. Okay. The Economist magazine actually just this week came up with a scenario of what the world will look like in a 3-degree world, and they completely emphasize the extreme weather event costs. So I think to some extent economists have been looking at the wrong place. Why have they been looking there? Because where do you look for the keys? You look under the streetlight, right? That's where the data was. That's the same reason they do research on baseball. So they missed this. Okay. Now we only in the last 6 or 7 years starting to have this quantification of how much the frequency and intensity of these events is changing. Okay. So we couldn't really do this kind of economic research 10 years ago because the scientists were not there yet in terms of understanding the changing frequency and intensity. Now they are. Now we can do this kind of analysis.
Thank you. And yes, I thought there might be some questions in the room. We get to check this. Alan, you ready? Hold it up reasonably close.
Thanks, Ilan. You said right at the beginning that we don't actually know the cost of a lot of these climatic events. I would have thought, I mean, the Public Finance Act really requires government to estimate that on the balance sheet each year, and I think the local government equivalent probably does as well. It doesn't necessarily account for private sector damage, and it may be that they're just not doing
So that's the fiscal cost. You're talking about the fiscal cost.
Well, the fiscal cost, well, no, I'm interested in the balance sheet cost, so that the reduction in asset value is there, but that'll be related to the fiscal cost.
So I haven't seen estimates of specific events.
No, you have to go into the balance sheets to see what you can see there. But what I was going to say was, in the infrastructure 30-year strategy that we're doing from the Infrastructure Commission, we have tried to quantify the impact on extra required infrastructure as a result of anticipated extra climatic events. It's quite significant. But of course, that's endogenous in one sense as well, because it does depend technologically on what is possible and what we develop over that time as well, particularly with regard to so-called green infrastructure, natural ways of draining out big waterfalls and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you like to respond, or could we squeeze in one more question?
Yeah, please, another.
Is that okay? Sounded maybe a lot more like. Thank you. Sorry, that will have to be the last question for someone.
Yeah, but just to clarify for Alan, so what I'm arguing is we are not doing careful accounting of how much we are actually spending. There might be projections about how much we are likely to spend, as not just fiscally, but generally in the society. The only sort of data we have is from the Insurance Council, how much insurance is paying, private insurance, and we also have the public insurer. And each, some units in government have their own, NZTA, for example, has their own numbers for the network of roading and how much is that. But we don't have a sort of a comprehensive quantification.